Hi everyone, we're going to go ahead and get started today with the 3DR webinar on preparing for Part 107. As we all know, the rule went into effect on Monday, August 29th. We are so excited to see all of the interest that you guys have expressed on learning more and learning how to prepare for this knowledge test. We will be recording this webinar, so if you have colleagues that you think would be interested in learning more, you can forward this on to them as well. So today we'll be discussing, we'll welcome you guys and introduce you to our newly minted remote pilot. We'll talk a little bit more about the background behind Part 107, what it is and why it came to be. We'll go over some of the publicly available resources, both from the FAA and from 3DR. We'll go over some top tips from our very own pilots here at 3DR, and then we'll go through a roundtable and talk to some of our people who have just passed the test. So here are our newly minted remote pilots. So first we have your instructor, Nico Bonnafoux. He is a solutions engineer at 3DR. He is also a commercial pilot and has taught flight school for over 8 years. Needless to say, he understands the FAA testing process inside and out. Because he was a pilot, he didn't take the Part 107 knowledge test, but suffice to say he has plenty of knowledge in the area. He cares a lot about drone usage, safe drone usage, and has thought a lot, even before Part 107, about how to merge the aeronautical rules that exist right now in the FAA in general with the drone world. And then we have Colin, who's the Chief Revenue Officer at 3DR, who just took the test yesterday. He's going to share some of his experiences taking the test and studying for it. We also have Dan McKinnon in the room. He's the Director of Product at 3DR. And then myself, I'm Lauren Burke. I'm a Product Marketing Manager. And Todd Harper, who is a friend of 3DR and is also in charge of mountain operations at Vail Mountain. So we'll go ahead and get started here. With Nico, I'll hand it over.
Hey, thanks, Lauren. Thanks, everyone, for attending. Thank you to Ameren Utilities, who's still hosting me here at their headquarters in St. Louis. So before we jump into Part 107, I just want to talk a little bit about how it's been before. So until a few days ago, there were no rules specific to commercial operations of unmanned aircraft. UAVs had to follow the same rules as any other aircraft. And because this is very difficult or impossible in many cases, the FAA had a process of exemptions. So companies would apply for what we called a 333 exemption. This involved a lot of paperwork, would take several months. And after 6 months or so, the FAA would come back to you and say, all right, great, I'll exempt you from the requirement to wear a seatbelt, for instance, when you're flying a drone, but I still want you to have a pilot's license. So because of this, companies had to contract manned aircraft pilots, or they'd train their own staff, which would cost upwards of $10,000. Some operators simply would just decide not to fly UAVs because the cost of entry was too high, and some other people would end up flying illegally. So at the same time, we had a lot of advancements in UAV technology, saw lots of change. We were moving away from small, custom, homemade drones, and also moving away from the need for people who are masters of the joysticks. Today we have people who are experts in their own fields. We have surveyors, civil engineers. We use unmanned aircraft as a tool to collect valuable data, and they do that simply by drawing out an area on a tablet using an app like SiteScan, which you can see here on the screen. So this, combined to the fact that drones have become much more affordable, much easier to use, means that we have more people than ever using them. And while these people don't need to be physically skilled anymore because of all the automation we have, they do need to be very knowledgeable about various topics relating to aircraft, airspace, or weather. And this is where the FAA has done a great job. So that brings us to today, Today, we finally have a set of rules that's tailored to unmanned aircraft, and that's what we call Part 107. So the FAA's created what I feel is a comprehensive and sensible path for people without any aviation background to operate unmanned aircraft and do so safely and share the sky with other aircraft. So we have a process now that's as simple as taking a test. So it's no longer a corporation or a company that has to apply for an exemption. It's just each individual operator applies and takes this test, which costs $150, 60-question multiple choice test with a pass rate of 70%. And so you pass that test, submit your paperwork online to the FAA, and a few days later, you obtain your temporary certificate, followed by a certificate, hard copy, that you get at home in the mail. So of course, to pass the test, you need to study. We'll talk about that in a second. But the good news here is that everything you need to be successful is available and free. So to assist our users and everyone in the industry, really, we've created a set of free tools that will help you pass the test and, most importantly, become knowledgeable and safe remote pilot. So Lauren here is bringing up our website, 3dr.com/FAA. So we're starting here on our study pages. On the introduction, I've outlined what I think is the best way to prepare for the exam. So first, I'd like you to take a look at what the FAA calls Airman Certification Standards, or ACS. This is something they publish for every pilot certificate, not just a remote pilot. And it's a great place to start because there you'll find an outline of all the topics that the FAA expects you to be knowledgeable about. So if it's not on that list, it's not on the test. It's a great place to start. Then I suggest you take the FAA's Small UAS online course. So we haven't talked about this yet, but the process for people who have a pilot's license, like myself, is different. So I took this course, got a graduation certificate, and just submitted that online to the FAA, and got my temporary certificate 2 days ago. But anyone's welcome to take that course. So you'll see it's a very straightforward course. It's quite easy, honestly, and it only covers topics that a licensed pilot would not already know. So bear that in mind. It won't cover every topic that you will be tested on with your knowledge test, but it's a great resource. And on that same FAA website, which is FAAsafety.gov, you'll find other free courses about topics, certification, weather topics, or airspace. So take a look there. So then the heart of your studying will be found in 2 sets of study guides. There's one that we've written. So you'll find them right here, 3DR study guides, and that covers all the essential topics. One of the big ones being airspace and how to use aeronautical charts. And when writing this, I try to make it very practical and useful so that you learn material to go, to carry on with you past the test, and something you can bring into the real world while you're flying your UAV. Then there's the FAA study guide that came out right at the same time. Very comprehensive, not super exciting at times, but you should definitely read through it. So once you've gone through all this, or first of all, in both of these guides, you'll find references to other documents, and make sure to go through those. One really good one is called the Pilot's Handbook of Aeronautical Knowledge. You can download that for free as a PDF, link on 3dr.com/FAA, or you can buy a printed copy for $10-15, and definitely worth having and keeping at home with you. So once you feel ready for the test, studied enough, take another look at the certification standards, make sure you've checked every box on there, And now you can move on to the practice tests we've put online. So I strongly recommend you save the practice tests for the end once you've studied. They're a really good way to identify areas of weakness. So don't waste them. Don't waste these questions until you've completed your study. So we have right now, I think, over 70 questions on the website. We'll have over 100 by the end of the week. And so these are real exam questions. Some were published by the FAA. Some are from different pilot exams. Some are from some of our team members or customers who've already taken the test. And so these questions, you might find exact same ones the day you take the test. But most importantly, you'll see that it covers all the same topics as what the FAA wants you to study about, and in about the same proportion. What's also important to note is that these questions use the same figures as the ones you'll see the day of the exam. Let's take a look at that. Once you're very comfortable with all this, it's going to be time to take the actual test. So for that, you'll go to our test center locator. And here we list all the FAA-approved test centers in the U.S. You put in your zip code, you pick a center that's close to you that you'd like to go to, and you'll call the 1-800 number that's listed there, and you want to give the person on the other end of the line the site ID number for your test site. They'll schedule an appointment for you, and that's also the time that they'll take your money. So have your credit card info ready. So I think it's $150 pretty much anywhere in the country. So be ready for that. Then in a few minutes, you'll hear Lauren tell you more about how the test itself takes place. But before I hand it over to her, I'll give you a few tips for when you're taking the test. So the first one is to use common sense and good judgment. So this applies to when you're flying, of course, but keep that in mind when you're taking the test. I think this tip alone could give you close to 50% correct answers. For instance, there's a question that asks something along the lines of, having just one beer will A, improve your peripheral vision, B, reduce the risk of hyperventilation, or C, any amount of alcohol diminishes the pilot's abilities. So of course, correct answer here would be C. And you might think I'm making this question up, but that's really a question on the test or something close to it. So use common sense. It'll go a long way. The next tip is, when in doubt, pick the most conservative answer. So this may not work every single time, but if you don't know the answer, that's the way to go. And you want to pick the most conservative answer from the FAA's perspective, of course. I'll give you two examples. One question will ask you, after moving, you should notify the FAA of your address change within 30 days, within 60 days, or 90 days. So I happen to know the correct answer here, but if I didn't, I would pick the most conservative one, which is 30 days, and I would be correct. So the FAA wants you to notify them within 30 days. You can do this online, by the way. It's very easy. Send you a certificate, but just do it within 30 days. I think Dan will tell you about that question. Another question asks, how many days before commencing an operation requiring a waiver should you place a waiver request? Again, it tells you, is it 30 days before the operation, 60 days before, or 90 days before? So here, the most conservative answer would be to ask very early on, so 90 days before the start of your operation. You should ask for a waiver. So when in doubt, pick the most conservative answer and wish me luck on my waiver to fly next to JFK at the end of the month. I don't quite have my 90 days there, but we'll see. My final tip is to use all available resources. So that's what the FAA calls crew resource management. Crew resource management means using everything that's available to you to make the best of things. So this applies when you're flying, when you're studying, and mainly when you're taking the tests. That's what we're talking about here. So I'm going to focus on one important resource that you should all be aware of. When you're you'll enter the testing room, you'll be given a testing supplement. And this is a book that contains all the figures that are referenced in the questions, and same one that we use in our practice tests. And we also link to this testing supplement, so you should take a look at it before you go take the test. You should probably use it while you're studying. Look at the aeronautical charts that are on there, look at the weather reports, look at the different diagrams that are in there. But another important thing about that book is that the beginning contains a legend, which is the same one you find on aeronautical charts. So for any question that involves a chart during the test, aeronautical map, just reference the legend that's at the beginning of the book. And that will be a lot of questions during your test, and the answer is just plainly written there. So just become familiar with that legend and make sure to use it during the day of the test. So I'll leave it at this for now. Let's hear from people who just took their tests, and I'll talk to you in a bit for some Q&A at the end. Lauren?
All right, thank you so much, Nico. That was a great overview on some tips and tricks and how to study for this exam and what's relevant both to the test and also to flying. So I'm going to give you a little overview about what to expect during the test. I took the test Monday morning, the 29th, in Oakland, California. It was my first FAA testing experience. I have zero pilot or aeronautical experience. I've definitely flown a drone a few times, but they fly themselves now. So I had a lot to learn. And for the whole testing experience, it's kind of typical of any test you would take in any test center. Arrive early, bring your ID, bring proof of your mailing address if it's not the one on your ID. I brought my car registration. It was super smooth. Once you get to the testing center, the workstations look exactly like this photo here. You'll get a stack of materials, which includes this supplemental book that Nico referenced, and I'll reference again in a second. But it's really important to know that that supplemental book is available online right now. So the same book that you're looking at in the actual course room is the same thing you can find online. You'll need you'll receive 2 white pieces of paper for scratch work, 2 number 2 pencils, a calculator for at least 1 question on the exam, and your computer workstation. This is just to familiarize you with what to expect when you arrive. And then on the test itself, I decided to add some of my top tips or things that tripped me up. So when I studied, I definitely studied the sectional chart and legend, and also the airspace, controlled airspaces. What I was surprised about on the test is they ask even the most busiest areas or airports. So I took an example of the Bay Area where it's a very confusing chart. So you could be asked about any airport or airspace within this section, and it's important to be able to identify which airspace any given airport they identifies within. Also, we have I recommend studying sort of the anatomy of an airport call out. So like that Metropolitan Oakland Airport call out here, know which frequency is for CTAP, which is for ATIS, etc., because those are differentiated between on the exam. And then same as what Nico was saying, always go back, read the legend if you're not sure. A lot of answers are there because you're also learning how to use your resources on this test. So you'll have resources available when you're flying, and you have resources available on the test. And then I always like to say, be clever. So if you think you can get more from the legend or from the materials you have, just go ahead and flip through if you have some extra time during the test. It's a 60-question test in 2 hours. So if you have a chance, just flip through the supplemental chart before you begin. And then I also, given that theme of the supplemental chart being being useful on both during the test and after, you know, you're going to be asked questions about the weather reports that are in the supplement. So use that supplement to study. Check out this terminal aerodome forecast and see if you can read through it and explain the different meanings here. There's no reason to study a different terminal aerodome forecast if you have the one that you're going to be tested on available online. So one thing to remember is after you pass the test, there's one last step to become a remote pilot with a certificate. You have to go to this IACRA website on the FAA, fill out your form, and then connect it to the test you took with the test report ID that you'll receive at the end. So next up, we're going to talk to some of our guests who are on the line right now. We're going to start by talking to Colin, who took the test yesterday. He is Chief Revenue Officer at 3DR. So I'm going to ask Colin a few questions about the test and about himself and give you guys a sense of other people who have passed this test. Hey, Colin, are you there? Can you hear me?
Absolutely. How's it going, Lauren?
I'm good. Why don't you tell everybody a little bit about your aeronautical experience?
Yeah, great. So I've flown drones now for about 10 years, and I have a lot of hours in an R-44, but never got around to completing the ground school, so I have very little ground school training. Mainly just, basic drone knowledge. I think probably a similar place that a lot of our attendees are probably starting from.
Okay, and tell us about how you studied for this test.
Well, I kind of wanted to see what would happen if I just said, okay, I'm going to give myself 45 minutes to study and just see what happens. I can always take it again in 2 weeks if necessary. So I actually went to a sandwich shop on the way to the testing facility and had my iPad. I only used the 3dr.com/FAA. I didn't go through all of it. I did probably like 20 practice questions, and I like how you do 5 at a time and then get graded on each of the 5. So within about 20 questions, I could see that it was the charts and the weather that was killing me. So then I went to the study guide on 3DR's website, looked up the basic chart information and some basic weather information. Like another 20 questions, and I started getting a few of the chart and weather ones correctly. And then, so I basically went from there to the test, and then during the test, you can mark questions with a yellow check mark to go back and look at them. So throughout the test, I was marking the ones that I was not 100% sure about or didn't feel super confident about. And I ended up, I think I marked like 25 of the 60 that I didn't feel 100% sure or confident on. And then my plan was to go back and spend a long time going through those 25 and really digging into them and seeing if I could, potentially change my answer. I kind of just gave my gut answer, and then the plan was to go back. But it was getting late and the traffic was building up, so I just said, oh, well, I'll just see what happens. And so I took it. It was like 40 minutes to take the test, and I did end up passing. Not by much, but I guess that doesn't matter. So it was a lot harder than I had anticipated it to be. The weather ones really got me. There were some pretty detailed questions about weather. The chart ones with a little bit of studying, I think everyone can totally nail. And then, a lot of the drone stuff is obvious. I think Nico's feedback about being, erring toward the side of conservativeness with the FAA is perfect. Understanding the difference between, resource management and risk management. There's always going to be a few of those. So, yeah, I think all in all, it was successful.
Yeah, any particular questions that have kept you up at night?
Yes, there are, but not related to the Part 107 test. So there was a few that were just kind of like, especially with the weather stuff, just, when you see a temperature inversion happening and it's a hot day with thunderstorms in the distance, what can you expect to see from a visibility standpoint? There was some that was just like, or what does this type of cloud look like versus that type of cloud? Literally, to get these right, you either know a lot about meteorology and weather, or you don't, and unless you're going to spend like 20 hours, because who knows what the question's going to be. It's not like there's a set number of questions that you have to understand. Like the charts, I think, are a lot more defined in the fact that there's a lot more narrow set of information to learn about how to read a chart, and then that'll go a long way and answer a lot of questions correctly. There was another one that got me that was something about how far below and how far away from clouds you can fly your UAS. And I said I think one of the responses was basically like something about keeping it clear of the clouds and not being in the clouds so that you could maintain line of sight. And so I thought that was the answer. And another one was like be 400 feet below and 400 feet away from the nearest cloud. And I thought that was a trick question because there's so much talk about being, under 400 feet. And maybe that was the answer. It doesn't tell you what the correct answer is when you see which one you missed. So, there was some tricky. Another one to know is that, you can fly above 400 feet if you're above a structure. There was one about how high the cloud has to be over a structure in order for you to fly over it, which I guess I missed that one too. So I guess maybe the cloud has to be 400 feet above the top of a structure in order for you to fly over the structure if you're supposed to stay 400 feet under the clouds. Maybe, and Nico can maybe verify that. But there was a couple in there that were pretty tricky, for sure.
Yeah, I think it's 400 feet below clouds, but I forget how far from clouds we need to be. Maybe Nico can step in at the end.
It must be 400 because that was that answer. That was 400 below, 400 from.
Okay, any last piece of advice to everyone listening?
I would say the best piece of advice I could give is just, I think if everyone here dedicated 3 hours to just really go through the incredible study guide you guys have put together and take the practice test, I think anyone here, if they spent 3 hours doing it, could go in very confidently and get a passing grade with that. I mean, you're spending $150. You've got to schedule the whole thing. It's kind of inconvenient to do, so you might as well spend a few hours studying. And I'm sure that if everyone did that, then it would be no problem.
Okay, great. Thank you so much, Colin. Really appreciate you taking the test early and sharing your story.
Absolutely, yeah. Thank you very much. I'm honored to share my experience.
Okay, so we have Dan in the room here. So Dan, I'm going to ask you a few questions. Why don't you tell us about your aeronautical experience before the test?
Yeah, thanks, Lauren. My aeronautical experience is very similar to Colin's in that I've been flying drones for about 5 years now, but have actually no experience with manned aviation. So this was my introduction to reading charts and understanding weather.
Cool. And tell us about how you studied for the test.
So I wasn't quite as cavalier as Colin. I spent more than 45 minutes at a sandwich shop, but I actually also felt like I'm going to take this. If I fail it, I can take it 2 weeks later. I'm going to print out all the FAA materials, and I intended to spend the weekends going over them, but probably also spend maybe 1 to 2 hours studying.
And tell us about the most challenging stuff on the test for you.
So I agree with Colin. In the most challenging questions on the test, we're not reading charts or reading weather reports, which I actually found using the legend, as Lauren, as you mentioned, and using the reference material that comes with the exam. You can decode these questions kind of in real time, but were the very specific questions about somewhat obscure areas of procedural stuff. For example, how soon do you have to let the FAA know you've moved, or how far should you fly from the guy wires on a control tower? And I think using Nico's recommendation of just choosing the most conservative answer really did me well on those questions.
And what advice would you have for anyone who's going to be taking the test?
So the advice I have is super straightforward. Is just understand how to read those charts, understand how to read radio frequencies, and understand how to decode weather reports. Because if you can do those 3 things, those are skills that actually are tested on this test, and those are skills you need to operate a UAS in the. And go ahead and read all the materials on 3dr.com/FA. There's a lot of great materials there, and I think spending about 5 hours on that site is what I would do to feel totally comfortable.
Okay, great. Thank you, Dan. So moving on to Todd. Todd, do we have you on the line? Can you hear us?
Yep, right here, Lauren.
Okay, thank you. Todd, you're coming to us from Colorado, correct?
That's right.
Okay, Todd, tell us about your aeronautical experience.
So it's much like everyone else. It sounds like we have a little more on the drone side than we do on the aircraft side, and I'm kind of in the same boat. It's been an interesting area for me, but more so focused on the drone side. So a little bit aircraft, manned aircraft, and a lot unmanned.
Tell us about how you prepared for the test.
So yeah, the 3DR study guide pretty much has everything, I would say, for anyone preparing for the test, and that's what I used. A couple of external things that I just knew about through friends who actually fly manned aircraft. But for the most part, everything you guys have put together has everything that anyone needs. And just going through it at a good pace, understanding what you're reading, and then trying to comprehend it as well. Don't just read it and say, okay, that's the answer. Just comprehend what the test questions are trying to ask you, and then comprehend the answer is going to set everyone up for success.
Okay, and any particular sticky areas or questions that you found to be troubling?
Yeah, we're all in the same boat. It's the it's the common theme through all of us here, and it's just it's the more FAA side of what they're asking for manned aircraft to know that we also need to know. So it's the charts, it's the weather, and it's some of the technical aspects of just how they word things and understanding what all their terminology means. So those are kind of the portions that I stuck to more so than the drone side, since that was already kind of just knowledge to me anyway. I focused more on the FAA strictly side.
And any advice for people out there that are going to be taking the exam in the next few days?
The number one thing I'm telling everybody is that you have 2 hours. Take your time. Don't try to rush through this thing. You know, Colin said it, I did it. There were questions in there I just skipped over. I'm like, I'll come back to that later. I went through all the ones that I did, all the ones that I knew rather, got those out of the way, and then just came back. Some guys are blazing through this. I took my time. And when I say I took my time, I really did take my time, and I did the test in an hour. But you have to, so take advantage of that time.
Yeah, I completely agree with that. I took the full 2 hours. I basically ended up taking the test twice. I went back to the questions I marked, but I also just went through the ones where I didn't mark as well, just to see if I had any better thoughts the second time around.
Yep, I agree.
All right, thank you, Todd, and thank you, Dan and Colin, for telling us about their experiences. I think we all had similar feedback. Sectional charts are tricky, weather can be tricky, but the regulations, that's the stuff that you really have to understand and memorize before the test. Okay, so I think we're going to move on to a few questions that have been asked during the presentation. We'll probably wrap up in the next 10 minutes. So I think the number one question we heard on the Q&A section is, how do we define commercial use? And the FAA is really clear on this. You can find out the answer directly for yourself at faa.gov/UAS/FAQs. Sorry, that's UAS/FAQs. And they define recreational or hobby use, which is something that is for flying for enjoyment and not for work, business purposes, or for compensation or hire. UAS for hobby is a pursuit outside of one's regular occupation engaged in especially for relaxation. So that means if you're doing anything for compensation or for hire, indirectly or directly, that is commercial use. It includes R&D, it includes search and rescue, it includes photography that you would be selling. So I recommend checking out the website directly yourself to answer those questions. Ultimately, and you'll learn this from studying, but you are the remote pilot in command, so make sure that you understand the regulations before flying, whether or not you have passed the test. Okay, so My team wants me to provide some clarity on the clouds question. So you can fly 500 feet below the clouds and 2,000 feet laterally from the clouds. Once again, study the information, get the most up-to-date regulations, but as of right now, that's the correct answer. I just want to add, I've seen 400 feet used too, and I think that was what was on the test, but there's not any trick questions on the FAA test, so you won't see like 400 feet or 500 feet and have to choose between the two. So pick the one that's most closely to 500 feet below and 2,000 feet laterally. So the next question is, what is the penalty for flying without a license? Once again, that can be found on the website. I don't have the answer to that right now. I'm wondering, Nico, if you're aware of the penalty?
No, I don't know what the penalties are exactly, but I'm sure that we should. I don't want to be the one finding out.
I'm pretty sure it's a minimum of 10 years of imprisonment and a $1 million fine, from what I understand.
That is Todd's clever answer for us, which means go take the test. I hope that you've taken from this that it's an investment on your side of $150, but it is completely doable if you study a little bit. One other question we got was, do you get correct answers after the test? So this one you get in two parts. Right after you take the test, your proctor, so the person who's administering the exam to you, will give you the option to flash the questions that you missed on the screen while you're still in the testing room. So you can see the questions that you missed, but they do not provide the answers to that. And you can only see them while you're in the room, and you can't take them with you outside of the room. So that's the most detailed report you get. Then when you leave the classroom and you actually get the report of your total test score, they'll give you some codes that look like a few numbers and letters put together. Those are your study codes. So those map to individual topics that the FAA is very transparent about what they're testing on. So you can see and identify trends and trends in where you might be missing in case you need to study to take it again. Another question that we have is how to contact ATC, Air Traffic Control. I know the answer to that, but since Nico has just gone through the process, I feel like he could explain it to us exactly as he's done it.
Sure. So there's a waiver page on the FAA's website. So if you need to flying in any controlled airspace which requires ATC authorization, you have to apply online for that waiver. It cannot be done by phone. It can't be done via VHF radio. You have to apply for the waiver on the FAA's website, and the FAA recommends 90 days before you begin the operation of it.
Thanks, Nico. And in case anyone didn't catch that, we've been monitoring audio, and sometimes I know it can be choppy. But what Nico was saying is you can file for a waiver to fly in controlled airspace on the FAA website. So not via radio, not direct communication with ATC, but rather a waiver on the FAA website. And if you get more information and basically more experience in using that waiver process, we'll be sharing on 3dr.com/FAA to let you guys know how that process is. And then there are other types of waiver, and that was one question, which is how to get a waiver. The other types of waiver can be to fly beyond visual line of sight, to fly during the nighttime, and to fly over people, so in a non-sparsely populated area and non-participants. That's the same process on the FAA website to file for a waiver from the Part 107 rule. And then the next question that we've seen is whether insurance is required as part of Part 107. And the answer is no, they don't mention that in the rule. Then the next question is, why does the FAA have so many acronyms? And anyone who has read through the FAA study materials will be familiar, although I'm not sure if you know all of the FAA acronyms. Maybe we'll turn that to our experienced flight instructor, Nico. Nico, why does the FAA use so many acronyms?
Because you're a pilot now. You get to sound cool and know all these cool acronyms that other people don't know. You can talk about ATC or MSL and, yeah, make you sound cool. Dan's very proud that he can now tell people he's a pilot.
Yes, exactly. So, yeah, as Nico said, you know, 4 of us on this call, or I'm sure there's more who have passed it, are all part of the Remote Pilot Club now. So we know some of those acronyms. I'm sure Nico can still school us. But I look forward to many of you guys on the call joining the Remote Pilot Club as well. Yeah, so we will send a recording of this webinar to everyone who not just attended, but also people who registered. Feel free to send it to any of your colleagues. If you're looking for the resources we discussed, you can just search Google for 3DR FAA or go to 3dr.com/FAA and everything will be available there. So thank you so much, everyone, for taking the time and joining. I wish you all massive amounts of luck on your Part 107 knowledge test and safe drone flying.